Who's watching lessons in chemistry on Apple TV? Nobody? Who's read the book? That's it? You should be reading that book. It's very, very good. It's a novel. It's all about a lady in the 1950s who's a scientist, but in the 1950s, women were not embraced by the scientific community. Very good story, and the TV version is very, very good. So if you have Apple TV, take a look. It's really worth it. All right, so let's get going. Today we're going to be wandering all over the place, but we're going to start way back. We're going to start in the 18th century with Percival Pott, who was a surgeon, a very accomplished surgeon, but that's not what he really is so famous for. He's regarded as the father of epidemiology because he became interested in chimney sweeps. And chimney sweeps are important. They were far more important then than now, because if you don't clean out your chimney, you get a fire. And there were numerous fires in England at that time from chimneys not being cleaned. So chimney sweep was very, very necessary. But chimney sweeps had a problem. They suffered from a rare type of cancer, which was cancer of the scrotum. And it was Pott who figured out what was going on. And it was the exposure to the soot and the smoke that caused the problem. And it wasn't only in adult chimney sweeps, because in those days, children were very often used as chimney sweeps. And when Pott figured out what was going on, this was instrumental in passing child labor laws. Believe it or not, children as young as 4 were used as chimney sweeps. Why? Because they fit into the chimney. So they would climb down the chimney as they were cleaning it. And of course, in the process, they would accumulate the soot and be exposed to the smoke. They were smoked children. And I mean, today, of course, it's very difficult to believe that children as young as 4 were used as chimney sweeps. But when Percival Pott managed to tie this all together, he recognized that the disease was caused by smoke. This resulted in the 1788 Act of Parliament, and this introduced regulations against child labor. This act stated that no boy should be bound apprentice before he was 8 years old. So 8 years old was okay. You could have children go into the trade of chimney sweep at 8 years old. His parents' consent must be obtained. The master sweep must promise to provide suitable clothing and living conditions, as well as an opportunity to attend church on Sundays. Right? Well, attending church on Sundays did not save them from the cancer that was caused by the exposure to the soot. Today, we know what the actual culprit is. It's a very specific chemical in the soot. It's called benzopyrene. And it's what we call an aromatic molecule. And in chemistry, the term aromatic does not refer to smell. It refers to a type of molecular structure, the ring structure that you see there, carbon atoms joined together in a 6-membered ring. Well, any time that we talk about smoke, there is the chance of the presence of benzopyrene. In fact, this is the main reason why tobacco smoke is carcinogenic, because we inhale the benzopyrene directly to the lungs, where it can interfere with the activity of DNA. Every time that you cook food, whether it is on the barbecue or indeed even on your stovetop, when you're heating it to a high enough temperature so that you get some charring, you're producing benzopyrene. And unfortunately, we also find it in smoked meat. Now, does that mean that we never eat this kind of food? I never like to say never about anything, but it certainly is clear epidemiologically, that is to the study of populations, that populations that consume more smoked foods are more prone to developing cancer. And it's interesting that, this was all unraveled originally by Percival Pott, which is why he's regarded as the father of epidemiology. Now, he was a very, very good physician, and he believed in what at that time could be referred to as the scientific method. But most medicine in those days was not scientific, and he was very much opposed to what at that time was called heroic medicine. Heroic medicine used techniques when nothing else could be done. And we're referring to bloodletting and purging. This was something that was standard treatment at that time because, of course, medicine had not evolved in a scientific way. It was believed that if you released blood from a person, they would get better because it was the blood that caused the illness. Today, of course, we know that this is not true. And purging meant, you would make them vomit, etc., to get rid of these supposed toxins in their body that were making them sick. Well, Percival Pott was opposed to this. And he was also opposed to the random herbal concoctions that were used at the time as medicine. Because, when you don't have anything, you try everything. So herbal medicine, of course, did have a long history of use, some of which obviously effective. It was known since ancient times that extract of the poppy, which contains morphine, to take away pain. But anyway, Percival Pott opposed all of these unscientific methods. And he was particularly vocal against a lady, Joanna Stevens, who concocted various kinds of herbal remedies. He called her an ignorant, illiberal, drunken female savage. He had a way with words. Anyway, Joanna Savage cooked up remedies at home that she distributed to kinfolk and neighbors, etc., as folkloric medicine, often does. And one of her friends developed tremendous pain due to a bladder stone. So she decided that she was going to come up with a treatment for this. Now, bladder stones can be severely disabling and cause a lot of pain. When a stone forms in the bladder, it happens usually when urine is held in the bladder for a very long time. And urine contains a number of salts, and when these precipitate out, they form a stone. And when the stone blocks the urethra, you can't urinate. And that is terrible, terrible pain. So she came up with a concoction to cure this problem. And it was a mixture of burnt eggshells, burnt snail shells, soap, and various kind of herbs. This was her remedy for bladder stone. Well, believe it or not, David Hartley was a medical practitioner at that time who suffered from bladder stones, and out of desperation tried Joanna Stevens' remedy and found that it worked. And he wrote a monograph on this. And he was well known at that time as a doctor. A view of the present evidence for and against Mrs. Stevens' medicine as a solvent for the stone. And he documented 155 cases where this had worked. So obviously, this became of interest. And all of a sudden, Mrs. Stevens recognized that for her, this was a money-making opportunity. Because here was a document from a doctor who was highly respected who said that this worked. So she was going to make money on it. And she said that she would reveal the secret of her remedy for £5,000, an unbelievable amount of money at that time. And that was a fortune at that time. But there were many people who suffered from bladder stones. So magazine, Gentleman's Magazine, which is a very popular magazine at that time, decided that they would try to raise the £5,000 for the benefit of mankind. This was one of the early examples of what we see today quite commonly. The fundraising efforts that are done on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram, where people try to raise money very often for medical treatments of their relatives. And most of the time, these are illegitimate scams, but sometimes not. So this was, an early attempt at fundraising. And they raised something like £1,500, not enough. So she wasn't willing to let her remedy go for that amount of money. But Hartley was still convinced that this was a functional remedy. So he urged Parliament to come up with the money. And believe it or not, they met and they said that they would grant the £5,000 if proof could be obtained that this remedy actually dissolved bladder stones. But how was this to be determined? Well, one of the most trusted people at that time was the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he was given the task of getting together a committee of doctors and scientists who would investigate this business. And they did. They investigated and they collected case upon case of people who said that their bladder stones actually did dissolve with this remedy. And they concluded that it works. So believe it or not, Parliament met again and they granted her the money. And she got the £5,000, an amazing amount of money. And here it is. This was the outcome of the parliamentary meeting for the discovery of the therapeutic potential of dissolving the stone. She got the money, never heard anything about her after. And she did, in fact, then publicly reveal what the remedy was. That was burnt eggshells, burnt shells of snails, soap, and various herbs. The herbs are inconsequential. There was nothing there that had any effect. But believe it or not, the other three ingredients actually did. Eggshells and the shells of snakes are made of calcium carbonate. When you heat up calcium carbonate, which is what she did when she, calcined when she burned the eggshells, you get calcium oxide. Calcium oxide is an alkaline material. When it dissolves in water, it becomes calcium hydroxide, which is a base, strong alkaline material. Well, it turns out that some types of bladder stones, which we call uric acid stones, dissolve more readily in an alkaline medium. They're acids, the base neutralizes them and makes them soluble. So what this concoction did was to make the urine more alkaline. Technically speaking, we say it raised the pH of the urine. So it dissolved the bladder stones. And it was, as it turns out, a real therapy as long as those bladder stones were uric acid stones. Not all bladder stones are uric acid stones. There's a whole range of bladder stones. But at least for those people who were afflicted with this, it worked. So I think this is a fascinating story. Because again, we're talking here 18th century, we're talking 1700s. Not very much was known about the workings of the body. And Percival Pott, who was as an accomplished scientist at that time as you could have, as evidenced by his determining the link between cancer and smoke. I mean, today to us, this is obvious, but certainly wasn't obvious then. So he was as good scientist as was available at the time. But he came out with this vitriolic attack on Joanna Stevens because it did not fit his paradigm. So the fact is that he should have investigated. And this is really the conclusion that we need to come to about the story, is that you don't dismiss something out of hand without really investigating it. So here was something that to him sounded nonsensical. How can taking eggshells and snail shells and soap become a remedy? Well, soap actually is alkaline. It's a basic substance, so that also contributed. So the thing is that it worked. Now, also in the 17th century, there was an American scientist who loved to investigate. And that was Benjamin Franklin. His history, of course, is absolutely marvelous for many reasons, including his scientific discoveries. Benjamin Franklin invented the bifocal glasses. Again, remember, we're talking 1700s here. He invented the lightning rod, which was one of the greatest inventions ever, because lightning strikes were common and houses burned when struck by lightning. Lightning rod saved it. He invented the Franklin stove, which was a huge invention, because at that time, the only way to heat homes was the fireplace. Now, the fireplace is not a very efficient way of heating. If any of you have fireplaces, you'll know that, because most of the heat goes up the chimney, right? So the benefit of Franklin stove was that it could stand in the middle of the room, because there was a pipe, exhaust pipe, that went up the chimney, and furthermore, it radiated heat from its four sides, whereas the fireplace, of course, just radiates from one side. So the Franklin stove was really at that time a breakthrough. But Franklin's favorite invention actually was that. Anyone know what that was called? It's a musical instrument. It was called the harmonica, not harmonica, without the H, harmonica. And it was a really interesting instrument. And this was his favorite invention, that he said. The principle here is the same as when you make music by rubbing your finger on a wine glass. It makes the glass vibrate and it makes sound. Well, the harmonica was essentially a series of glasses of different size. And you would, with your hand, put it on the edge of the glass, and your foot with the pump thing to make it turn, and you could play music. So this was the harmonica. All right, but now let's get to another very interesting invention of Benjamin Franklin. One day, he sent a package to his brother. And inside of the package was a note. And the note said, "It is as flexible as would be expected in a thing of the kind that I imagine will readily comply with the terms of passage." Anyone know what was inside that package? Well, his brother suffered from urinary stones and from urinary retention. And what Franklin had done was to invent the first really flexible urinary catheter. And there it is. And therein lies the story. And it's a major story. Some of you probably have personal experience, because it is one of the most important devices ever introduced into medicine. The word catheter comes from the ancient Greek catheter, meaning to send down or to let down. And of course, what you're letting down is urine. If anyone has ever suffered from urinary retention, I suspect there are some people here who have had that dreadful experience. It is the most painful thing that you can experience. It is unbelievably painful. The pain is off the scale. You know, when someone has urinary retention, and usually ask them, "What is your pain on a scale of 0 to 10?" What do they usually say? 12. Yeah. Unbelievable pain. So Benjamin Franklin's brother suffered from urinary stones, and at that time he had to self-catheterize. And I'll show you some of the early instruments that were available at that time, but they were stiff instruments, so you can imagine that's quite a challenge to put that in. So anyway, Franklin decided to take a look at this and to improve. And he came up with the first flexible catheter, and here it is. And it was a coil of silver wire, tightly wound. And then he filled in all of the spaces here with tallow, with fat. So this was like a spring which could bend, and it could follow the urethra, which of course has turns in it, and go all the way into the bladder and essentially drain out the urine and obviously relieve the pain. There are several reasons why people have urinary retention. Bladder stones are one, where the stone actually blocks the urethra. But the other situation is enlargement of the prostate. Now, the prostate surrounds the urethra. It is just below the bladder. And if it gets enlarged, swollen, what it does is it squeezes on the urethra, which means that the urine doesn't go through easily. This is the reason why men suffer urinary retention more than women. But women also suffer, obviously, not from an enlarged prostate, but they can also have bladder stones. And they can develop strictures in the urethra that reduces the flow of urine. So when we talk about catheterization, although I'm using men as a model, it also applies to women. I mean, women also have to have catheters for various reasons. All right. Well, let's go back historically. I mean, obviously, urinary retention, whether it's due to an enlarged prostate or to bladder stones, is not a modern invention. I mean, ever since humans were on Earth, this condition existed. So what would someone do thousands of years ago If all of a sudden that you have urinary retention and you have this unbearable pain, what do? Well, the only thing that you can resort to is to try to somehow drain out the urine from your body by inserting a catheter. But what could they use before medical instruments were available? Well, they would use hollow reeds, straw, right? Which, of course, has a hole through it. And you would insert this. The ancient Egyptians were already able to do this. We have records of that. But as you can imagine, this was not a straightforward procedure. And the procedure itself was painful, but nevertheless, Hippocrates, who of course is regarded as the father of medicine, was the first one to try to formulate a flexible catheter so that it could be easier to insert, so that it could follow the twist of the urethra. Now, lead is a very malleable metal, and they knew how to make tubing out of lead. But the trouble was that you really couldn't make it thin enough. I mean, in order to go up the urethra, it's not a water pipe, right? You need something that is quite thin. But at least he experimented with this. But he also knew of another procedure. If people suffer from bladder stone and you can't go through the urethra to relieve the urine, what else is the possibility? How else can you get rid of the bladder stone? You cut open the bladder. Now, we think of surgery as being a modern invention. No, the ancient Greeks performed surgery of all kinds. They could do amputations, and they could cut for the stone. And they would sew up the bladder after, and in some cases, if they could avoid infection, people would survive. Now, the idea of doing surgery to take out a bladder stone goes back to about 3000 BC. An ancient Sanskrit document already describes procedures for removing a stone from the bladder. Hippocrates knew about this. Hippocrates, of course, is famous for the so-called Hippocratic Oath. And there are a number of, famous points in the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors will only do good, they will not perform abortions, etc. But there's a passage in the Hippocratic Oath that most people have never heard of, and here it is. That doctors should not cut for the stone unless they are really expert at it, because the survival of the patient was not very, very good. So, we're going back with Hippocrates to about 400 BC, and he was already concerned about surgical malpractice. In the 1st century AD, an excavation of a house built, the house was built in the 1st century AD. The excavation, of course, was much later, 2,000 years later. But an excavation in Pompeii of a house of a doctor, they found an early catheter, which was curved. It was a bronze tube. The Romans already knew about bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin. And when it's melted and poured into a mold, it will retain the shape. So they were able to make a catheter that had the right curve, which conformed to the curve of the urethra, so that it could be easily inserted. And again, remember, we're talking 1st century AD. I mean, Pompeii was a remarkable place. Who's been there into Pompeii? So you'll know, right? It's an amazing place. It was a Roman city, which was essentially destroyed by the eruption of volcano, and basically the ashes from the volcano covered the town. But that also meant that everything was buried and preserved. And later on, of course, it was all excavated, and some of it is remarkable. Some of the stores that the ancient Romans had were fully intact. And you had public toilets, with seats one beside the other. The Romans did that. They would hold meetings, sitting on the toilet. And you see this totally preserved at Pompeii. And the frescoes, paintings on the walls were really incredible. So when they, excavated the house of this doctor, they found a catheter. It was being used 2,000 years ago. And then Avicenna, perhaps the most famous of the Arab physicians, basically made a type of flexible catheter by rolling up animal skin and sticking it shut with lead. It probably wasn't very comfortable, but it worked. And by the Middle Ages, as you can see, there were all kinds of catheters that were available for use. We have documentation of that. Although I doubt that the gentleman stood by so calmly while a catheter was being inserted. But obviously, they had the means of relieving the unbelievable pain. And then, in the 16th century, Ambroise Paré, French physician, was physician to the French kings, actually manufactured a tube made out of metallic silver. Silver is quite malleable. But the real breakthrough came with the discovery of vulcanized rubber. Now, rubber is an exudate of a tree. At that time, it only grew in South America. This liquid is called latex, and it hardens into rubber. But natural rubber is actually very brittle. It breaks easily. The big invention, accidental discovery, was made by Charles Goodyear. Now, Goodyear was a very interesting character. He thought that God had given him the task of curing rubber, of finding a way to make rubber more usable. And he tried all kinds of things, mixing rubber, everything from soup to cream cheese. Nothing worked. So one day he accidentally spilled some of his hot latex on his stove, where he had also spilled some sulfur. He had tried to mix the sulfur with the rubber before, but only at room temperature. But now, when the rubber spilled onto the hot sulfur, it became what eventually the term used was vulcanized, after the Roman god of fire, Vulcan, who was fire that made this happen. And today we know what this actually did. The sulfur atoms joined together the long chains of rubber molecules, and it made the rubber much more flexible and much longer lasting. And vulcanized rubber changed the functioning of the world because it made possible tires. As cars were invented, you could make rubberized boats. Rubber was a huge breakthrough. And of course, the medical community also seized upon this discovery. And a French physician by the name of Auguste Nélaton fabricated the first really flexible catheter made out of rubber. I mean, this was much more flexible than Benjamin Franklin's silver coil. This was very close to the kind of stuff that is used today. But the question was, is it possible to find a way to keep this catheter in the bladder for a long time? Because what they were forced to do in those days was when someone suffered from bladder stone or enlarged prostate. Whenever the bladder filled, they would have to catheterize themselves and drain out the urine. The question was there a way to permanently insert a catheter? And if you do, how do you hold it in place? Well, they had some ingenious ways tying in the catheter like this with strings, as you can imagine, not very, very comfortable. But then along came Jean-Francois Rayvard, a French surgeon, who had an idea. And this was the seminal idea to the modern catheter, because he devised one that had a little balloon at the end that, once inserted through another tube, could be filled with water, so that when that little balloon at the end of the catheter expanded, it would hold the catheter in place. And on the side of the tube near the top, there was an opening where the urine could drain out. This was a huge breakthrough. And it was essentially based upon this model that Frederick Foley invented what today is known as the Foley catheter, and is the most widely used catheter in medicine today. And the idea is very similar to what we saw before. You need a balloon at the end that can be inflated once the catheter is inserted to hold the catheter in place, so that it does not come out. So the Foley catheter has a channel inside through which you can inject water to inflate the balloon once this has been inserted. And then a valve closes and holds the water inside, so it holds the catheter in place. And so the basic idea is that once it is inserted, you inflate the balloon in the bladder and it holds the catheter in place. And this has been a godsend for many, many men and women. Because I told you, urinary retention is not fun. And the Foley catheter today essentially solves the pain issue. Of course, there are problems with it. I mean, one problem is that it can get encrusted. That is, little stones can build up inside of the catheter, as you see here. So today they've developed various kinds of coatings, like with Teflon, for example, so that the stones don't stick in the catheter. So it's still an evolving technology. Now, the Foley is a catheter that is left in place. But there are situations when people don't want a catheter permanently, but on occasion have to have one. So these are the so-called intermittent catheters. And these are used, people learn how to use these, how to insert them. And there are many different kinds, and they come with lubricants, etc. And people just learn to insert it themselves. And it has changed numerous lives. Now, you may think that this talking about a catheter and materials, etc., is some sort of an esoteric topic, but this has had tremendous impact on the global population, because there are so many people who suffer from these problems, which are solved by catheters. So Benjamin Franklin was the first one to create this flexible catheter, and he did it because his brother suffered from bladder stones. And as fate would have it, he himself, when he got older, developed bladder stones. We're not sure whether or not he used the catheter on himself. He did not ever record that. But one thing that he did record was that he suffered from gout, which is an equally painful condition. And it is amenable, of course, to cartoonists, because when you have gout in a joint, again, the pain is virtually indescribable. It does have a dietary connection, and Benjamin Franklin wrote about this. He thought that it was his indulgence in wine and food, etc., and girls that was the problem. But he did find a remedy. And that was an extract of the autumn crocus. And Franklin is often credited in medical texts with introducing this to North America, which is actually somewhat questionable. The autumn crocus remedy was already known in France. And the French doctor Manuel Poussin wrote a treatise on this, Au Medical, and described the extract of autumn crocus. And by the time that it was determined that the active ingredient in this remedy was autumn crocus, that was after Franklin had died. So Franklin didn't really know that there was some active ingredient in the autumn crocus, but that doesn't mean that he may not have used it, because of course they were using autumn crocus since time immemorial. But it's questionable that he introduced it into North America, sometimes given credit for determining that autumn crocus is a remedy for gout. It was known in Europe already. But today we know why it works, because the autumn crocus contains a compound called colchicine. And colchicine has the ability of dissolving uric acid, and uric acid is what builds up in the joints. And it really does feel like your joints are inflamed when you have gout. It's so painful. When you have gout in your toes, you can't even put a sheet over your, when you go to bed, because the slightest touch that just sends you screaming. And the reason is the deposition of uric acid crystals in the joints, and that causes inflammation, and that causes tremendous pain. Now, as I said before, the connection to autumn crocus was known even by the ancient Egyptians. The famous Ebers Papyrus mentions using autumn crocus to treat pain. And Dioscorides in the 1st century AD wrote a famous book called De Materia Medica, which basically was a compendium of all the medical knowledge at that time. He mentions the use of autumn crocus for gout. Of course, they didn't know what gout was chemically, they didn't know how it worked, but they knew that autumn crocus could relieve it. Today, if someone has gout, we only tell them to go and graze in a field of autumn crocus, because the colchicine can be extracted from the flower, purified, and put into pills in standardized doses. But it's a very interesting connection to ancient medicine. They were right. Autumn crocus is a treatment for gout. But today, you give people standardized amounts. And of course, when you find that a medicine works for some condition, you start researching to see what else it is good for, because the body has all kinds of inflammatory possibilities. And it turns out that colchicine actually does have some effect. It does have an effect on heart disease, because when you have buildup of cholesterol in a coronary artery, that causes inflammation, which can lead to the closure of the artery, which can lead to a heart attack. So colchicine has proven to be of some use. in heart disease. But there's another very interesting use for colchicine. How this was ever discovered, I have no idea. But if you take a solution of colchicine and you put it on some plants, it changes the genetics of the plant. And this is how seedless watermelon was discovered. Turns out that when you drench the watermelon plant with colchicine, when it's growing, it produces the melon without seeds. Well, actually, it does have seeds, but the seeds are so tiny that you can't see them. Just an interesting little sidelight. No one ever was able to explain how someone tried to do this. But anyway, we now have seedless watermelon thanks to colchicine. And there's something else that colchicine can do. It can kill. Of course, dosage matters. But in a dose that is not too far above the therapeutic dose, colchicine can be deadly, as we found out just a couple of weeks ago. But this guy, medical doctor Connor Bowen, decided to do away with his wife. And he did it with colchicine. And the police got onto this because her death was suspicious. And they searched records and they found on his computer that he had been doing research on colchicine. And he had been looking at dose-response relationships. That is, what was the toxic dose? And the real clue was that they found that he had actually looked for a certain weight, right? Because whatever is toxic depends on body weight. And the weight he had entered was the weight of his wife. So that's how the police got onto him. And he's awaiting trial right now. See what happens. It's going to be a very interesting story, murder story.
Where do you buy colchicine?
Well, you can get some autumn crocus and extract it. Make a nice tea with autumn. Yeah. Also awaiting trial these days are bottled waters. That is the bottle itself. Well, let me introduce you to an interesting principle, Locard's principle. When two materials, doesn't matter what they are, if they come into contact, there will be some transfer of material between them. Why is it called Locard's principle? Because Edmond Locard was a French forensic scientist. In fact, he is the father of forensic science. And he was the first one to design a laboratory that was just dedicated to forensic investigation. Became famous, so famous that the French even have a stamp after him. He was kind of a real Sherlock Holmes because he investigated blood, investigated soil samples, investigated footprints, fingerprints. It was really something. All right, so the idea that when two things come into contact, there's always transfer material from one to the other. The reason I mentioned this is because of the story that started baby bottles. And you may remember this was about 10 years ago, when baby bottles made of a certain plastic, polycarbonate plastic, were banned. And the reason is that they were found to leach a chemical called bisphenol A into the formula. And that was an issue because bisphenol A is one of these chemicals that is listed as an endocrine disruptor. That is, it has hormone-like properties. Well, polycarbonate is a very, very rigid, strong plastic, very useful plastic. And it is made by linking together bisphenol A and another chemical called phosgene, and that's how we make polycarbonate. So the bisphenol A is not there in the final product. It is one of the chemicals used to make the final product, but the conversion is not 100%. No chemical reaction goes to completion 100%. So there are still remnants of the starting material. And that is what leached into the formula. So here we have low-charge principle. You have two things in contact. You have the plastic and the formula. When they meet, there's going to be some exchange of material. But the bisphenol A is not something that you want in your formula. So when this was determined, then of course we had the BPA-free bottles, because any bottle made of polycarbonate is no longer allowed for baby food, so different plastics were used. Now, polycarbonate was not only used in baby bottles, it was used in all kinds of water bottles. These are typical polycarbonate bottles. But of course, people were worried about BPA in anything, so these also were switched, and now we have all of these BPA-free water bottles. But recently, we had a very interesting study published in the scientific literature where they investigated what happens when you put water into bottles that don't have polycarbonate. Therefore, bisphenol A is not an issue. So what they investigated were all kinds of bottles that you can now buy on the dollar store, wherever you buy these water bottles. They're not made of polycarbonate, they're usually made of polyethylene or polypropylene. And the question was, is there any transfer of material? Of course there is, according to the low-charge principle, but what and how much? So the researchers tested a number of different kinds of water bottles, and they used a glass bottle as a control because very little leaches out of a glass bottle. And they filled them with water, they tested them, they had very sophisticated instruments, gas chromatograms, mass spectrometers, to find what was present in the water. They tested the bottles even after dishwashing. So the question was, you take a new bottle, you take a bottle that in the dishwasher, does it take a difference? And the results were surprising, even to me, because this is what they found. Thousands of compounds in the water. Many of them came from the plastic, but a lot of them came from the dishwashing detergent. But we're talking about thousands of compounds, and even when the bottles were rinsed before being filled with water after having been dishwashed, there were still 800 compounds in the water that had been stored in these bottles. And the thing is that some of these compounds were in the family of endocrine disruptors, the same class of chemicals as BPA. And most of these came from the detergent. Now the detergent that you use in your automatic dishwasher is a very complex mixture. It contains everything from slip agents so that the water can easily coat the glass. You have antioxidants because you don't want mold growing in there anyway. It's a whole complex mixture. So thousands of compounds in the water that you're drinking out of these water bottles. But, very big but, the presence of a chemical does not equal the presence of this. So just because you find it doesn't mean that it's doing anything. And nobody suggests that in this case, that those chemicals are doing anything. They're found in very small amounts. The only thing that this really shows is that it's a testimonial to the ability of analytical chemists to find down to the parts per trillion. Part per trillion is the width of a credit card, the distance between the Earth and the Moon. We don't find that. Okay, but it doesn't mean that it's doing it. Some people say, all right, well, then I'm not going to use plastic bottles at all. I'm going to just switch to stainless steel. Yeah, very little comes out of that. But what you have to remember is that we are exposed to thousands and thousands and thousands of different substances every day in our food, in our cosmetics, in the air, in the water. And you can focus in on anything and make what sounds like a very bad scenario out of it. I mean, coffee is a classic example. Coffee contains over 1,000 different naturally occurring compounds, including acrylamide. Acrylamide in animals is a known carcinogen, but we know coffee doesn't cause cancer because the amount that is in there is trivial. So I don't think there's a need to worry about these bottles of water. But neither do I think that there's a need to go around clutching these bottles as if they were lifesavers, as people do. And they think that if they don't take a sip every minute, they're going to turn into prunes. Okay, that just is not the case. This idea of having to drink 8 glasses of water a day is a myth. Your body will tell you how much water you want to drink. You do not have to force yourself to drink those 8 glasses. Okay. Now, we do need water, obviously, but you get your water from the fruits that you eat. You get it from coffee, you get it from tea, you get it from milk. You get it all over the place. So you don't have to strive to drink the 8 glasses of water. All right, one more story, and it does deal with water, because something that really does require water is duckweed. Now, this is probably something that you never heard of before, but I have an interest in duckweed. Why? Because I'm interested in ducks, and anything that's related to ducks, I like to take a look into. So when I heard about duckweed, I decided that I better have a book like this. Well, duckweed is an aquatic plant, and as you can see, long roots that reach down into the water, but each one is sort of the size of a very small jellybean. And when duckweed grows, it sometimes can cover water like this. It is totally edible, and in Asia they eat it. So they harvest it, and there it is. They make salads, whatever, out of it. Well, in the future, astronauts may be eating it. Food is a big problem when it comes to space travel. Now, not when you go into orbit around the Earth. Of course, you can supply food from the Earth as they do. But when we're talking about going to Mars, this is a different story. You're talking about a trip that's going to take at least 9 months to go there, 9 months to come back. And of course, you want to spend some time on Mars when you've got all this effort to get there. It is impossible to take a long enough food on a journey like that. It would be a huge bulk of material that cannot be taken. So the question is, how is this problem going to be solved? Well, somehow you have to be able to produce food along the way or on Mars. Well, it turns out that duckweed is very, very nutritious, very high in protein, high in vitamins, and it grows very, very quickly. So it has potential of being taken along for the ride on the spaceship, and it will grow and produce food. But as you know, for a plant to grow, you need photosynthesis, right? You need carbon dioxide, light, water. Well, you can have light, of course, in the spaceship, you can have water. But where's the carbon dioxide going to come from for the growing of the plant? But we exhale. Astronauts, of course, exhale carbon dioxide. You eat food, your body combusts the food, you produce carbon dioxide. So that's how it will be produced. But the duckweed apparently does not taste very good. But as it turns out, when it is growing, whatever you put into the solution where it's growing, it will absorb the flavor. So you can make duckweed taste like bacon by putting bacon flavoring into the water. So this is a potential for space travel. But duckweed has some use right here on Earth. You know, a lot of the fish that you eat grown on fish farms, as they are called. And this is what that looks like. And they're stocked and the fish are multiplying. But of course, fish also poop. And they produce a lot of nitrates in their poop. And that is a water pollutant. Well, it turns out that duckweed can use the nitrate as a fertilizer. And so when they put duckweed into these fish ponds, it cleans the water and allows the fish to grow better. And then you can harvest the duckweed and eat it. You can also use the duckweed in sewage treatment. And these are treatment tanks, and the duckweed is grown in there. It absorbs nutrients, and again, you can eat it. I mean, people might not like the idea of, eating something that was grown in sewage, but perfectly good. And there's yet another possible use for duckweed, and that is to use it as a fuel. It will burn, right? Plants burn. And you can actually genetically engineer the plant by introducing a gene that will make it produce more oil. And that oil can be used as diesel fuel. And another benefit is that you don't need agricultural land to grow it. One of the big problems globally, as we have more and more people, is that you have to cut down more and more forests to produce more agricultural land. Well, duckweed, of course, can be grown in ponds. You don't have to cut down forests to do this. Now, of course, not everything about this plant is good. Sometimes it can totally take over. And when it covers the water, it will exclude light so that any natural plants in the water cannot grow. So that could be a problem. But there's one final little question about duckweed. Why is it called duckweed? Well, the reason it's called duckweed is because apparently it's a delicacy for ducks. They love to eat it. And it's a very interesting plant. And in the future, we may be eating it. So you may be going home to a duckweed salad. We'll see. But it is one of the most nutritious and fastest growing plants. So what can we say about all of this? It's just duckweed. All right, if you want more stories about all kinds of stuff, you go to our website. You can sign up for our weekly newsletter. We'll give you all kinds of interesting info and also entertain you. So if there are any questions, we can try to handle them. Yeah. The RSV vaccine, as far as I know, there's no downside to it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, not that I know of. I mean, bamboo is it's a tree actually. It's biodegradable, so when you throw it in the garbage, it will eventually biodegrade. No, it's I mean I don't know the economics of it because bamboo can be turned into fiber and it can be made into cloth of all kinds. You get bamboo sheets, they're actually very, very comfortable. So I don't know, how much did that cost? Is it more expensive than the plastic? No, I think it's fine. No, it's one of the approaches to cutting down on plastic. Yeah. No, you just have to make sure that you're washing it out. Yeah, you have to wash it because remember, I mean, if you're drinking from the bottle, your saliva goes into the water, right? Your saliva has bacteria in there. And water is a great medium for bacterial growth. So you gotta wash it out when you fill it. No, stainless steel is a pretty inert material. Well, when I say it doesn't come off, I mean, I for sure that if you really tested it to the part per trillion, you would find something because at that dose you find anything. Glass is the best. Yeah. Nothing comes out of glass. Yeah. Is there? No. Both of them come in different varieties. So some of them are calcium carbonate stones, some of them are something we call struvite stones. And in order to know what the treatment is, they generally have to test the urine to find out what kind of stone it is. Not necessarily. It can form either in the kidney or in the bladder. But sometimes the kidney stone will travel to the bladder. But you can also form it directly in the bladder. You don't want either. Whatever your body, the question is about the number of glasses of water you drink. When you're thirsty, you drink. Your body will tell you. Now, there are some conditions, such as when you have kidney stones, where they will tell you to drink lots of liquid. That's a difference. Okay, so we'll see you next month.